There are men who fight with swords. There are men who fight with speeches. And then there are those rare men who fight with ideas, so sharp, so revolutionary, that they slice through empires. John Adams was one of those men. When we think of the American Revolution, we picture muskets, battlefields, and banners of liberty. But behind every musket, behind every signature on parchment, there was a mind on fire, and few minds burned hotter, clearer, or more defiantly than that of John Adams. This is not the story of a general. It is not the story of a king. It's the story of a lawyer, a thinker, who believed that the power of truth was stronger than the power of any throne. The cinematic beginning, the fire before the storm, picture it, Boston, 1761. The air thick with colonial tension, taxes, laws, and orders flowing from a distant monarch who had never set foot on American soil. Ordinary farmers and merchants were being crushed under imperial weight. And in the middle of this rising storm stood a man, compact, intense, relentless, his mind a weapon forged in the furnace of reason. John Adams wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a preacher. He was a man who believed that the battlefield of the 18th century would be intellectual. That revolution would begin not with bullets, but with arguments. And those arguments would shake the world. He once said, "Liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people." It wasn't poetry. It was prophecy. Because the revolution didn't begin with gunfire. It began with awareness. The colonial lawyer who defended his enemy, here's the paradox. John Adams, the man who would become one of the architects of American independence, first became famous for defending the British soldiers charged in the Boston Massacre. Think about that. In a city boiling with rage, Adams stood up in court and defended the very men accused of shooting his own countrymen. Why? Because he believed that justice, even for your enemy, was the foundation of freedom. He told the jury, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." That line echoed through history. It was more than a defense, it was a declaration of principle. A nation built on emotion would collapse. But a nation built on truth could stand forever. That was John Adams, uncomfortable, unbending, and utterly unafraid to stand alone. The philosopher of rebellion, every revolution has its muscle. Washington had his armies. Every revolution has its soul. Jefferson had his words. But John Adams was its conscience. He believed that freedom wasn't just a right, it was a responsibility. He told his fellow colonists, "You will never know how much it cost my generation to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it." Adams was not charismatic like Jefferson, nor graceful like Franklin. He was blunt, restless, argumentative. But when he spoke, men listened, not because he flattered them, but because he forced them to think. His vision of liberty wasn't just political. It was moral. He believed that a republic could only survive if it was built on virtue, not vanity. Freedom without character, he said, is chaos disguised as democracy. That idea, that freedom demands discipline, became the intellectual backbone of the American experiment. The war of ideas, let's be clear. The American Revolution wasn't just fought between Britain and America. It was fought between two worldviews. One said, power flows from kings. The other said, power flows from the people. And John Adams, armed with his pen, his passion, and his relentless logic, became the loudest voice for the latter. He called monarchy a fraud upon the human race. He called liberty a gift that must be guarded even from ourselves. He knew that democracy wasn't inevitable. It was intentional. It had to be built brick by brick, principle by principle, argument by argument. When the Continental Congress debated whether to break from Britain, many wavered, afraid, uncertain, unready. But Adams stood in that hall like a flame. He thundered that independence was not treason, it was destiny. He said, "Before God, I believe the hour has come. My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it." That speech, that single defiant burst of clarity, pushed the colonies toward the Declaration of Independence. That's how revolutions happen. Not by the swing of a sword, but by the certainty of conviction. The intellectual architect of freedom. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, he didn't write it in isolation. He wrote it with the constant counsel and fire of John Adams. It was Adams who argued that the document must not just condemn a king, but announce a new kind of world order, one built on reason, not rule. Adams didn't care for fame. He didn't crave applause. He cared for clarity. He believed that the revolution would mean nothing if it wasn't anchored in law, ethics, and education. He once wrote, "The happiness of society is the end of government." And that simple sentence redefined what power meant. No longer the privilege of birth, but the servant of the people. That was the revolution behind the revolution. The philosopher becomes a statesman when independence was finally declared. Adams didn't rest. He went to war, not on the battlefield, but in the arena of diplomacy. He crossed the Atlantic in treacherous seas, negotiated with European powers, secured alliances, and helped shape the Treaty of Paris, the very document that ended the war. He wasn't charming like Franklin, but he was unyielding. Where others sought comfort, Adams sought results. He saw every negotiation as an extension of the same principle he had defended in court. Truth must prevail, even when it costs you popularity. And it did. Adams was often unpopular, too honest for politicians, too blunt for aristocrats, too fierce for the faint-hearted. But that's what integrity looks like in motion. The weight of vision. By the time the war ended, John Adams had earned a place not just in politics, but in history. He had become the intellectual bedrock of the revolution. And yet, even as the new nation rose from the ashes of empire, Adams worried deeply that liberty would destroy itself from within. He warned, there never was a democracy, yet that did not commit suicide. To him, freedom was fragile, a fire that could illuminate or consume. That's why he fought for structure, for law, for balance. He believed that the revolution would fail if it became a mob with a flag. It needed institutions, ethics, and education, the pillars of endurance. And that's where his brilliance lay. He didn't just want to create freedom, he wanted to sustain it. Revolution is easy. Rebuilding is not. When the war drums faded and the muskets cooled, the real battle began. The battle for the soul of the Republic. And in that battle, John Adams became both its guardian and its warning. He had no illusions. He knew that the victory against Britain was only the beginning. The next fight would be harder. The fight to govern ourselves. He said it bluntly, while all other sciences have advanced, government is still an infant. Because while men could invent machines and map stars, they still hadn't learned to govern their own greed. Adams understood that freedom wasn't a permanent gift. It was a discipline. A republic, he said, could only survive if its citizens were moral enough to sustain it. And that's where he clashed with the very people he helped liberate. The idealist among pragmatists, while Jefferson dreamed of a nation of farmers and poets, Adams feared anarchy. He believed that liberty without restraint was a new kind of tyranny, the tyranny of ignorance. He warned, liberty, once lost, is lost forever to him. Revolution wasn't about chaos. It was about order built on justice. And in that belief, he was both revolutionary and conservative, a paradox wrapped in conviction. He fought for independence, then defended authority. He argued for liberty, then cautioned against license. He was never trying to be popular, only principled. That's why his presidency would be one of the most misunderstood in history. The president no one loved, but everyone needed. In 1797, John Adams became the second president of the United States. Following George Washington, the unchallengeable hero, was an impossible task. And Adams stepped into it with the weight of expectation crushing his shoulders. He wasn't charismatic. He didn't flatter. He didn't charm Congress or the press. He led with intellect, not charisma. And in politics, that's often a death sentence. But history doesn't reward charm. It rewards character. And Adams had plenty of it at a time when France and Britain were tearing Europe apart. America was being pulled toward another war. The public wanted blood. Adams wanted peace. He refused to send young republics into the grinder of European greed. He said, "Great is the guilt of an unnecessary war." And though that decision cost him his popularity, it preserved the republic from destruction. That's leadership, doing what's right, not what's easy. The Alien and Sedition Acts, the great stain, but greatness is never unblemished. Adams, for all his moral fire, made one of the gravest errors of the early republic. He signed the Alien and Sedition Acts. It was an overreaction to fear, a legal muzzle placed on dissent and criticism. It contradicted the very freedoms he had fought to establish. That's the tragedy of intellect. Sometimes the mind overrules the heart. Adams thought he was protecting the republic. Instead, he wounded its spirit. But here's the difference between tyrants and men of principle. A tyrant doubles down. A man of conscience reflects, repents, learns. Adams later recognized that his laws had gone too far. And history, harsh as it is, forgave him. Because his intentions were never selfish, only misguided by fear. That's what makes him human. Not perfect, but real. The rivalry that defined an era. Then came his great rival, Thomas Jefferson. Two men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder now stood worlds apart. Jefferson, the poetic idealist. Adams, the relentless realist. Their letters became battlegrounds of philosophy. Jefferson believed in the wisdom of the people. Adams believed in the discipline of law. Jefferson saw freedom as nature's gift. Adams saw it as civilization's achievement. They were not enemies. They were the two halves of the American mind, the dreamer and the doer, the philosopher and the builder. It was Adams who said, "Posterity, you will never know how much it cost the present generation to preserve your freedom." And it was Jefferson who replied, "I like the dreams of the future better than the history of the past." Together, they formed the tension that made America real, the constant argument between liberty and order. Without that argument, democracy dies. The fall from grace in 1800, John Adams lost the presidency. He left the Capitol quietly, refusing to attend Jefferson's inauguration, a silent symbol of political heartbreak. But here's the irony. His greatest act of leadership came not in victory, but in defeat. Because when Adams lost, he walked away peacefully. He set a precedent no king could ever imagine. That power could transfer without bloodshed. That simple act turned the revolution into a civilization. Adams understood something that many never will, that true greatness isn't about winning power. It's about limiting it. The exile of the forgotten founder, after his presidency, Adams retreated to his farm in Quincy, Massachusetts. There, he lived like a philosopher, reading, writing, reflecting. History had moved on. The people had turned their eyes to Jefferson, Madison, Monroe. But Adams, the fiery revolutionary, never stopped thinking. He wrote letters by candlelight that still burn with brilliance. He debated with old rivals, mentored young thinkers, and recorded the lessons of liberty for generations unborn. He once wrote to Jefferson, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." And those letters, their correspondence in old age, became the most beautiful reconciliation in American history. Two men who had fought side by side, then fought against each other, now united again. Not in politics, but in wisdom. They proved that even revolutionaries can evolve. The philosopher's final years. In his final years, Adams lived quietly but proudly. He watched the Republic. He had helped survive wars, scandals, and elections. He saw his son, John Quincy Adams, become president, a legacy that would carry the family name into the 19th century. But even then, he warned that liberty could never rest. He wrote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." To him, freedom wasn't a self-sustaining flame. It was a fire that needed constant tending. Because without virtue, liberty becomes license. Without wisdom, democracy becomes chaos. He saw clearly what many still refuse to see. That revolution is only the beginning of responsibility. The sun was setting over Quincy, Massachusetts, and the old revolutionary sat by his window, watching the same sky that once hung over Lexington and Concord, the same stars that had watched the birth of a nation, now watched one of its founders prepare for eternity. John Adams was no longer a man of action, he was a man of reflection. And yet, even in silence, his mind was a battlefield of ideas. He had spent his life wrestling with the paradox of liberty. That freedom demands restraint, that democracy requires discipline, that progress without virtue leads only to ruin. He was a student of history, and history had taught him that republics are fragile things. Rome fell not from invasion, but from corruption. Athens collapsed not from enemies, but from excess. And so Adams spent his last years warning a young America that its greatest threat would come not from abroad, but from within. He wrote, "There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide, not from tyranny, but from apathy, greed, and the decay of moral courage." He knew that the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, not against kings, but against ourselves. The two deaths of a revolutionary on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day since the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams lay dying. The nation he had helped create was celebrating its golden jubilee, and its most stubborn architect was breathing his last. Outside, bells rang. Cannons fired in memory of independence. Inside, an old man whispered his final words. Thomas Jefferson still survives. He didn't know that hours earlier, in Monticello, Jefferson too had drawn his final breath. The two titans of the revolution, the realist and the dreamer, departed on the same day, as if the very soul of America had chosen symmetry for its farewell. It was as though Providence itself had written the ending. Two minds that had clashed, converged, and ultimately completed each other, now gone, leaving behind a republic still finding its way. The philosophy that outlived the man history often forgets the thinkers when it remembers the warriors. But John Adams was both. A warrior of words, a soldier of reason. He fought not for conquest, but for conscience. Not for fame, but for the foundation of an idea. And that idea was simple, that no man, no government, and no generation has the right to rule without virtue. Adams believed that the republic would endure only if knowledge triumphed over ignorance and reason over passion. He said, "Facts are stubborn things, because in an age of emotion, truth must be the last refuge of the free." He never sought monuments, never demanded adoration. His victories were invisible, found in the structure of law, the logic of government, the quiet stability that followed the storm. And that, perhaps, is why he remains less celebrated, because Adams built the house others lived in. He crafted the architecture of order while others painted it with poetry. But when the winds of history howl, it's the foundation that holds. The eternal warning, Adams's ghost, still haunts the conscience of democracy. Every time liberty turns to license, every time politics descends into theater, his words echo through the ages. Public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private virtue. He reminds us that freedom is not a festival, it is a duty. That the republic is not self-sustaining, it must be fed by knowledge, courage, and sacrifice. And in that sense, John Adams was not merely a man of his century. He was a prophet of ours. He saw the danger of power without principle, wealth without wisdom, and speech without truth. He warned that democracy, left unchecked, would devour itself in the name of its own freedom. And looking at our modern world, you realize he wasn't wrong. The intellectual father of America, if George Washington was the sword of the Revolution and Jefferson the pen, then John Adams was its conscience. He gave the revolution its reason. He gave freedom its form. He took the raw chaos of rebellion and shaped it into a system, flawed but functional. He taught a restless people that liberty is not about doing whatever you wish, but about creating a society where justice governs desire. He believed that freedom without morality was merely another mask for tyranny. That was his lifelong creed and his eternal legacy. The legacy of a reluctant hero, Adams never wanted power. He wanted principle. He never wanted worship. He wanted wisdom to prevail. And yet, history has a strange way of rewarding its most reluctant heroes. 2 centuries later, when nations still debate the meaning of freedom, his words remain the compass. He once said, "Posterity! You will never know how much it cost us to preserve your freedom. I hope you will make good use of it." Those words were not nostalgia. They were a warning. Because Adams knew that every generation will face its own revolution, not with muskets and cannons, but with minds and morals. And that's where his story transcends time. The final reflection in the vast arc of human history, from empires to republics, from monarchs to constitutions, few men stand as clearly between chaos and order as John Adams. He was the architect of restraint in an age drunk on rebellion. He was the skeptic in a crowd of dreamers, the philosopher among politicians, the man who saw that liberty without discipline was a fire that would consume its own house. And that is why, though his name may not adorn monuments, his mind endures in every stable government every principled debate, every constitution that values reason over rage. His life was not about glory. It was about endurance. Not about noise, but about structure. And when the story of America is told, it will always begin with men like Washington and Jefferson. But it will survive because of men like John Adams. Thus ended the life of a revolutionary philosopher, but began the legacy of reason, a legacy that reminds every free people that liberty, once lost, is lost forever.